starting point was looking at prophecy in Hebrew scripture as something that tells us who God is, what God does, what God makes possible for human beings. Past, present and future. Prophecy, of course, as we're often reminded, not simply looking to the future, but looking into the depths of what is, and particularly looking into the depths of God. Who God is, what God does, and what God makes possible. And I think you can see how that connects with where I brought it yesterday in relation to what Jesus says, quoting Isaiah, it's what the Spirit of God does. Liberating, bringing home, making clear. And in these addresses, I've looked at the very different ways in which the lives, words, the style, as you might say, the key in which the prophets sing varies and pinpoints different aspects of that prophetic task. We began with Jeremiah and his protests that he was not up to the job. Protests which recur throughout his long book. Jeremiah telling us that although he declared he could not, as a young man, speak the word of the Lord, God promised to hold him steady in the middle of that costly witness. And we see as the book unfolds how Jeremiah both protests continuously against what he's been lured into doing. You have seduced me and I was seduced. Nonetheless, the word remains steady. And the key thing, he can't hold it in. It's just something that has to find expression. Successful or unsuccessful, popular or unpopular, the word is given, and because it's the word it is, pushes through into expression and communication. We looked at Ezekiel. We looked at the ways in which Ezekiel's problem was the over-familiarity of his own context. How do you speak the word of the Lord to people who think they know pretty clearly what the word of the Lord is? How do you make the word of the Lord strange and new when all around you there is a religious culture that is making it stale all the time? Ezekiel's own overwhelming visions, the complexity and glory and beauty of those visions, upholds him. But also he knows that what he's driven to is silence and accompaniment, sitting alongside, waiting for the words to come if they ever do. Which tells us, of course, that sometimes the way in which the word of the Lord becomes new and fresh is in silence, in our withdrawing from the solutions we think we're sure of and the words we're comfortable with. We moved on to Hosea, the complex, troubling story that Hosea puts in front of us of his own dysfunctional life. The sense that his own complex experience of recovering a relationship is something like what is going on in God. That God's inability to give up what he loves is translated somehow into the prophet's own life. The life becomes part of the word. And it's as if in the story of Jesus in the synagogue of Nazareth, all those themes are gathered up and woven together. Here is Jesus fresh is the word, from his encounter with the devil in the wilderness. Jesus who has just discovered in the most extreme of circumstances what it is and what it isn't to be God's child. And what it isn't is a life in which magical solutions can be guaranteed and protection is assured. Jesus returns from the desert knowing this and heads for his home. As we've seen in the narrative as Luke gives it to us, he is himself deeply conscious of all the ways in which his Jewish history has shaped him. He went to where he had been brought up, and he found exactly Ezekiel's problem. People who thought they knew who he was and who God was, and who pushed him out. At the same time, the first recorded miracle in Luke is the encounter with the man with the demoniac spirit who says, "Go away," because falsehood can't live in the same space as truth. But as Jesus stands in the synagogue at Nazareth, he declares, as you might say, once and for all, what the prophetic spirit is up to. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. And yesterday we reflected a bit on the way in which that good news is a bringing back from exile out of alienation. How that good news is opening our eyes to see what's true and real. How in every way that work of the Spirit which anoints Jesus is a work of liberation. And we looked at the rather awkward question of what our Christian communities look like in that respect. Go and tell John what you hear and see. So what do people hear and see around us? Do they see clarity and honesty? Do they see the possibilities of homecoming? Do they sense liberation? Because that's what it is to be a prophetic church, listening to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So that's really just a summary of what I think I've been saying, hope I've been saying, how it hangs together in my mind. There are other ways into that great story in Luke. There are other prophetic texts that we could have looked at, and I hope that I may have perhaps prompted your appetite to go and look at other prophetic texts and maybe read them in that light. Perhaps also to be a little bit suspicious of the over-easy ways in which we can use the language of prophecy, as if, as I said, it's just a matter of turning up the volume, as if it's just a matter of denunciation or dramatic taking of a stand. Looking a bit deeper than that, asking what a prophetic community might look like and how we're to be part of it. So that's what I've been attempting to share. And I've been profoundly helped and challenged and enlarged in my mind by the questions that have been asked, by the perspectives that have been given in these last couple of days as we've shared the after-supper sessions. And I hope that in the time we've got left today, which is, I think, probably between 3/4 of an hour and an hour, but don't feel pressure. It would be good if people wanted simply to share things they've learned, things they want to explore further. Not so much Q&A, if that's all right, because I think it's important just to share more positively a bit what you've sensed and what you might want to say to one another. I'm here at the other end of the lectern if there are specific questions, but I'd hope that in this session it's perspectives to share rather than questions to ask, and we'll see how that unfolds, shall we? So maybe just a couple of minutes of silence, reflecting on that whole picture and trying to distill what you might want to say in and to this group, to myself, to anyone else, but distilling a little and that work will go on. So let's just take 2 or 3 minutes to be quiet and see what surfaces. A great Welsh medieval tale, the tale of Branwen Verchlir. Branwen is Princess of Wales who marries King of Ireland, and it all ends very badly. But in the course of this, her brother, King Bran, who happens to be a giant, leads his troops across the sea to Ireland to rescue his sister. And at one point they come to a broad river which can't be crossed. And Bran, the giant, lays his body across the river and says, "You walk across my body." And that, says the narrator, that is why we have a proverb in Welsh, "Avor ben byd bont." If you want to be a leader, be a bridge. Responded to 1 or 2 things that have come up before we draw to a close, because there's been a huge amount of wisdom and depth in what's been said so far, and all I'm doing is just sort of picking up, reflecting things I've been hearing. One phrase that came to mind is from a writer I've quoted more than once already this week, and that's my beloved French authority, Madeleine Delbrel, D-E-L-B-R-E-L, since somebody did ask me, Madeleine Delbrel. One of her aphorisms about Christian leadership was, if all you have is a bugle, all anybody who hears you will want to do is fight. In other words, or if your only note is a trumpet, a bugle, then all anybody will want to do is fight. It's a version of, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail sort of thing. And I think that's a dimension of some of what people have been raising. There's a self-conscious attachment to the model of confrontation, which can dig itself into the hole that has just been described. And that's no judgment of any individual, it's more a judgment of our collective imagination, which loves the drama. Sometimes drama is not what it's about. The other thing that Madeleine Delbrel said was, 10 years after making a great decision for something or other, to marry, to join a religious community, to undertake some kind of work, 10 years after, you find yourself saying, exactly the things that brought me into this work are now the things that are weighing most heavily upon me. The things I most loved are the things weighing most heavily. And she says, you'll hear this after 10 years of marriage, you'll hear this after 10 years in a religious community, you'll hear, etc., etc. And she says, of course, it may be 5 years or 17 years, it always feels like 10 years. And I think what she was saying there is something about disillusion. Be prepared for what you thought you came for, in T.S. Eliot's words, not being quite it. It's not a reason for giving up. It's a reason for opening up. Maybe that's a significant difference. Not a reason for giving up, but for opening up. But the model you started with, which looked so life-giving, so exciting, has actually slipped away. Now what? And I often go back to the life of Thomas Merton here, as I guess others in this room will do. Someone who, with a huge, tsunami-like force of enthusiasm for the monastic life, goes into the most strict, traditional monastic structure he can find and embraces it 120% and writes beautifully about it. And about 10 years on, in the Madeleine Delbrel way, thinks, what was I thinking of? But doesn't walk away. He keeps, I was going to say keeps digging, not in the sense of digging into the hole, but digging for something deeper and something more solid. And with all the false starts and all the self-deceptions and all the muddles of his later life, nonetheless, what he's doing is trying to find something beyond the moment of disillusion. I think that's an interesting kind of trajectory in Merton's life.
Because, yes, he doesn't just go away, he doesn't unsee. But he does say, my attachment to this is now actually eating away at me and at others. I've got to find somewhere else to look from. Otherwise, down the drain. And I think when I spoke of that dimension of some people's lives, I had one or two individuals in mind whose single-minded passion about something, whose prophetic passion about something, had become something that was eating them up and not actually any longer being a living witness, but a diminishing one. And that's where the community comes in, to put an arm around such a person and say, you know what, you need some quiet. You need another focus. Giles, whom I mentioned, the friend who'd been so active with the inclusive church movement, he wouldn't for a moment say that he'd taken his eyes off the injustices that people like him suffer in the church. But he would say, I was getting absolutely trapped by that. I was being reactive all the time. You can't just be reactive. Hence the shift of focus without saying no. But digging the hole is a good analogy. Some people are able to stick with a difficult vocation and make something of it. Some people recognize, I need a change of place and focus. The community's discernment, the community's empathy becomes all important, I'd say, in that discerning task. You mentioned Jean Vanier, and I debated deeply in myself whether to start talking about Jean the other day, and decided I couldn't really. I knew Jean, and loved him, and the disclosures about him were a real personal issue. I read through some of the hundreds of pages of the report that was drawn up by L'Arche in France. L'Arche, of course, survived all this disclosure about Jean. And that says something. It says, I think, that what he achieved, modelled, talked about, was in the event more than just his own troubled and tangled personality. We're not, I think, called simply to judge or absolve. We are called to recognise the destructiveness of the patterns in which he got embroiled. But I think we're also called to say, and that wasn't the whole story about him. And that's hard. Somebody I know very well indeed was extremely close to Jean and spent a lot of time with Jean looking after him in his last illness. This is a person who knew absolutely nothing about this side of Jean. And will still say, what I knew in Jean, I believe was real. And even knowing now that there was more, doesn't quite de-realise that. It's so complicated. You see why I didn't much want to talk at length about this.
If I could just add to that, I was a very good friend of John Howard Yoder's, and it's exactly the same. And I've sort of struggled around that issue as well. But there's so much that he said that was so good, so important. To just write that off as though it wasn't important. It's impossible for me to do that. And then you think of your own life and you say, hang on a moment, if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't take me seriously either. So, it's prophets are not necessarily always saints in
No, they're not. And the truth is, the painful truth is that a lot of people, ourselves included, are only too glad of the excuse to stop listening to somebody uncomfortable.
Exactly.
We say with a sense of relief, you have feet of clay, so I no longer need to listen to what you're challenging me about. That's the only thing.
Could I just comment on there's never going to be another Desmond? Where are you?
I think he's gone. He's left.
Timothy's gone.
I was going to say maybe he is, but he's gone. There won't be another Desmond, of course, a fairly unique individual, and some of you know he was here most Thursdays during his stay in Hermanus, and what an incredible person. You don't get another one like that. Or a Bosnian, you don't get them because prophets are all different. I mean, all the prophets you talked about were different people. And some of us run away from Jezebel often. So we're not looking for another Desmond, we're not looking for another Bosnian or D. And in any case, I think the sober reality in South Africa is when we say the prophetic church that spoke out against apartheid, and it was very real, it was very significant, it was very important. But it was that moment, that time in history, that context, that made it so. We're not living in that time, and the prophetic is always for the time in which we are. Those who try to reproduce what they were saying 30 years ago in South Africa won't be listened to because it's not speaking to the context in which we live. Prophets have to arise in the context in which we now live. And that's what we're struggling with. And I see people arriving right now who have come for us to say thank you to. So maybe we need to wrap up.
One last comment, if I may, before that, and it's a word I wanted to pick up and just toss back into the pool. You talked about the danger of making things thinner, and that's really very near the heart of what I think we need to reflect on. The risk in trying to be immediate, contemporary, trying to live up to the images we have, is of thinning out what's actually there. And thinning out the reality of the Spirit's presence, thinning out the immediacy of the present challenge, thinning out the immense resources we have to make sense of our humanity, etc., etc. So, as one of my colleagues in the Church of England recently said, let's go for full-fat Christianity.
Full what?
Full fat. Because that is what actually nourishes the prophetic, the priestly, the reconciliatory, whatever. So I'm glad you nailed that.